Okay. I'm here once again after technical difficulties with Father John Whiteford, and hopefully we got this all figured out. I don't know if we really even did anything, but we'll see how it goes from here. How are you doing, Father?
Doing good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Enjoying a day off, staying hot, all that good jazz.
Yeah, we're in one of the months that tries the loyalty of the residents of the state of Texas, but that's what makes the state virtuous.
Well, it's funny because my wife's from South Africa, and when her dad came and visited, he was here for a few months and visited us and stayed at the house. And I was driving over the road at the time, and she was working in Beaumont, and she got home one day from work, and she walked in the house, and she's like, "It feels like an oven in here." And she walked over to the AC unit, and he had turned the heat on and turned it all the way up to 100 degrees. He couldn't get warm enough even in the summertime around here.
Wow.
So yeah, he's from Namibia originally, so he's used to that desert weather. So he was wearing long sleeves all through the summer. It was
Wow.
insane. So well, I wanted to have you on. You had gone through some trials and tribulations when setting up Saint Jonah and not having a church to call your own there for a while. And I've heard a few people talk about this over the last few weeks, and I figured it'd be a great good conversation to have if you could just go through the background of Saint Jonah, how you were introduced to Orthodoxy, coming from the Nazarene faith, and all that, and just kind of get into that, and then what people can do going forward.
I discovered Orthodoxy by a couple of different things converged. I was studying to be a Nazarene minister, and I started reading the Fathers of the Church because the Nazarenes, with their connection via Methodism to Anglicanism, they at least theoretically had some appreciation for tradition. And around the same time I started to do that, I met an Orthodox priest because I was involved in the pro-life movement. And as I was digging in, had a conversation. I'd had conversations with him on issues related to what we were doing in the pro-life movement, but then I called him up to ask him a theological question, and one thing led to another. And so I got first sort of curious about Orthodoxy, then more seriously interested. Then I got to the point where I could see converting, but I had like five issues that I had to resolve, and then eventually my five issues got resolved, and then I converted. But that happened in Oklahoma City, where I was going to school right outside of Oklahoma City at Southern Nazarene University in Bethany, Oklahoma. And at that time, St. Benedict's was just to the south of Bethany, although now it's more on the southeast side of Oklahoma City. But they have a
Mhm.
proper church, whereas when I was going there, they were in a storefront. But I um, I was already married, so I wanted to go to Jordanville to go to seminary. I converted right after I graduated from Southern Nazarene University with a BA in theology, and I had a free ride to go to a Disciples of Christ seminary where I could have gotten a law degree and a master's of divinity degree, but I took one course to kind of dip my toe in the water because it would have involved me moving out there, but they had a satellite course in Oklahoma City. And I thought my professors were liberal until I took that class. But this guy, I don't think he even believed in God. And I just decided, I spent 4 years studying unbelieving German liberal scholars, and I don't think I want to spend another 3 or 4 years getting a master's degree studying the same people. So, so I then started looking at going to Jordanville, but I went up there for about 3 months, and it was a really good experience because I got to see what monastic life was all about by living in that community, and I got to go through um, like the first half of Lent before I moved back. But the economics of it just weren't going to work. I went up there with the hopes that I'd be able to find a job, find a place to live, and then be able to bring my wife up there. But it just didn't look like it was going to work because upstate New York probably still is not a whole lot better. But back then it was certainly not good. And plus, I made the mistake of coming up there in the middle of the winter, which is probably the worst time to try to find a job because there's not a whole lot happening in the wintertime up there. So my plan B was to move back to Houston, which is where it was where I grew up. And that's actually where I met my wife. So her family was back there too. And so Jordanville had a correspondence course program. It wasn't particularly good, but I took what they had and then was mainly studying informally and then on my own with the priest at the parish. That there was only one ROCOR parish in Texas at the time, which was St. Vladimir here in Houston. And the priest there was a graduate of Jordanville, and he was actually he's a very interesting. He's still living. He's a very interesting priest. He's a Greek American named Father George Lourdes, and he could speak modern Greek. He knew the various forms of more ancient Greek, and he could speak Russian, and he knew Church Slavonic, and he was a
Wow.
liturgical nerd. And on top of all that, he was literally a rocket scientist working for McDonnell Douglas.
Mm.
So he was a contractor that was working with NASA, and so I learned a lot from him, and I learned basically Kleros liturgics especially. But eventually he moved, and also I had kids, and I'd been in that parish long enough. I was made first a reader there, and then I was made a deacon. And I served as a deacon in that parish for about 3 years, and it was mostly Slavonic. I could handle it. At the vigil, it was mostly English, except on Great Feast, because I was the one doing most of the singing. So it was English, but because of that necessity. But the liturgy was mostly Slavonic, and on Great Feast, it was almost all Slavonic too, which made it difficult. You go through Lent preparing for Pascha, and then on Pascha everything's in Slavonic. It's not quite the same as when you can understand the hymns. But anyway. So I started as I'd been in that parish long enough. I think I was there a total of about maybe 6 years. I saw that what tended to happen with the children growing up in that parish is when they got to their teens, they obviously kicked up enough of a fuss that their parents stopped making them go to church because they didn't understand the services, and consequently they just stopped coming. And I decided I was not going to have that happen with my own kids. And so I started asking the bishop about the possibility of starting an English language mission. And it's a long story, but eventually we did get the blessing. But I was a deacon, and we had a blessing for an English language mission. So we were doing services in the room that I'm sitting in right now, and this is my study, and but then we were using it as a chapel, but still a very small room, couldn't hold more than about maybe 25 people, and at that uncomfortably. And we would get a priest that would come in maybe once every other month to serve for us. Fortunately, during this time period, every Holy Week, we were able to get a priest to come and serve the main services of Holy Week for us, including Pascha. But that certainly made it difficult. And one thing I found was it's hard to grow a mission when you're not doing regular services, at least not regular priestly services, because particularly in an area like Houston, where there are other Orthodox parishes to go to, people are usually going to pick a parish that has priests and where they can take communion over a parish that has missions. Reader services most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But gradually, we got enough people. And also God gave us a nudge because we had a pipe that cracked in my house and flooded the area where we were having services, and my house was all carpeted at that time, so we had to rip out all the carpet, and that meant that we couldn't have services there for a period of time, and so we started looking for a storefront. It was a bit of a stretch. We were wondering if we were going to be able to pay our bills. But we got into a small storefront, then we got into a bigger storefront, and then we were able to buy the property we're on now, and then we were able to build the church that we're using right now. And right now we're working on building a bigger church. But all this took But I got the blessing to start the mission in 1998, and we bought the property we're on in 2008, and we built the church we're using right now in 2010. And now, 14 years later, we're outgrown the church that we have, and we need to build a bigger church. But the period of time when we didn't have a regular priest, I did learn the joys of reader services. And so one thing I would say to people who are in a situation where they don't have a church that's super close is that you do need to make contact with the nearest church that you can practically go to, even if you're only able to go there a couple times a year. But obviously, if you can go there more often than that, that's better. And you can do reader services at home. But to learn how to do reader services, you need to learn how to do them well, I would say. You need to learn how to sing the tones and the fixed parts of the services. And there's different ways that you can go about that. But a really good CD set that you can get is called Tone Tutor. But there's also some stuff on the web you can use to learn the tones. Now, I'm a functional musical illiterate, so I had to just learn the music from memory. And when I look at sheet music, I know that if the notes are higher up on the scale, that the notes go higher, and if they're lower, they go lower. But I couldn't sing from sheet music if I didn't already know the music. So if you know music, that would put you in a better situation. But for me, I just had to memorize it. And there are mnemonic devices that I would use to learn the tones. So, for example, with the Traparia, I should say there are 4 different types of hymns in terms of the tones. Like you talk about, there's tone 1, but tone 1 has different forms. So there's the Troparian melody, there's the Stakiran melody, there's the Irmos melody, and then there's the Perkimenon melody. And the Perkimenon melody is also what you use for the Alleluia verses. And so for each one of those tones, you generally are learning 4 different patterns, although in some cases, the Stakiran tone and the Troparian tone are the same. And in some cases, the Stakiran tone and the Irmos melody are the same. So you do get a freebie occasionally. But what I had to do was, I should say, back when I was at the parish in Oklahoma City, I was singing in the choir, so I was learning the music. But when you're singing in the choir director gets you started, and then you know what you're singing. So you don't have to generate the tone from memory. But what you have to do if you're singing by yourself is you have to be able to remember, okay, I'm singing the first Troparian tone. So how does that go? Well, for the Troparian melodies, I generally just learned a particular Troparian that I remembered was tone 1. So, for example, the Troparian of the Cross is tone 1. So if you learn the Troparian of the Cross, you've learned the first Troparian melody. For the Stakiran melodies, I memorized you don't have to sing these the intro verses. When you sing the psalm verses between the Stakira, a lot of parishes don't bother singing those. They'll just have the reader read it, and that's fine. But the parish in Oklahoma City, that the reader would read the first half, and then the choir would sing the second half. And so that's a better way to do it. And I would memorize a phrase that went with that second half, because it does lead you into singing the Stakiran tone. And so, like for tone 1, I would memorize that with that phrase with there is only one God. There is only one God, and then I could remember da 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 da, and so there's different ways that you can go about it. Long story short, you could just, if you didn't want to mess with that introductory phrase, you could just memorize a Stakiran and make up words that have the number of the tone in it. So, because the way Russian music works, at least, is once you learn the musical pattern, you could actually sing from the phone book or the newspaper. There's no number of words that you have to have, or a number of syllables that have to be on a line for you to be able to do it. Byzantine chant's a little bit more difficult to make that work, but Russian chant's more flexible, which is one reason why I would recommend the average person learn Russian melodies rather than try to do Byzantine, although I did learn some of those too. And I think they are beautiful, particularly when you're singing by yourself, Byzantine chant, because it's melismatic. It adds it has more interesting elements to it when only one person's singing. Whereas in Russian chant, it's really designed for 4-part harmony.
Mm.
So if you have 4-part harmony, it sounds really good. If you have only one person singing, it's not quite as nice, but still nice. But it's just a lot easier to learn the Russian melody. So that's what I would recommend. But you also have to learn how to put the services together. Now, fortunately for people who are trying to learn this, I put a lot of this stuff online to make it easier for people. So I have the Reader Service Orologian, which is if you go to stjonah.org, and it's saint spelled out, and if you go to the bottom of the home page, there's a big icon that says liturgical texts and resources. So if you click on that, it'll take you to a page that has all kinds of links. One of the first links that you'll see is the Reader Service Orologian. And Orologian is the book of the hours, and so it has the fixed portions of the services. And so I laid out all those services the way they're supposed to be done for reader services, just to make it simple. And then I also post for feast days and Sundays the Typica variables text. So these are the texts that you insert into the fixed parts of reader service Typica. And so if you have those two texts, you've got at least the words you need for the services. You still need to learn how to sing the various parts of it. I also post rubrics online, and also I'm the editor of the St. Innocent liturgical calendar, so you could buy a hard copy of the liturgical calendar. But for the services that people do, if you're just doing feast days and liturgies, or when a liturgy would be done for Sundays and feast days, the rubrics that I post online are generally all you really need. But I also have started a video series, although I have not added anything to them since last summer. But if you go to the St. Jonah YouTube channel, there's like maybe 4 or 5 videos I've done about how to do reader services, and I'm intending to pick back up on that this summer. During the school year, I'm teaching in the pastoral school for our diocese, and so it takes up some of my extra time. Makes it a little harder to keep producing additional content for folks. But I intend to pick that up where I left off. But that gives you a pretty good idea of how to go about doing reader services and putting services together.
I often wonder whenever I speak to different priests, I often wonder where they find all the time in a day. So y'all are always, I'm like, do y'all ever sleep?
Well, one thing I discovered many years ago, I think it was maybe 2004 or something like that, but I discovered the wonders of Franklin Covey planners and their time management systems. And I really recommend that to people. I talk to people about it in confession a lot, because a lot of times what I hear people telling me is that they really don't have a good handle on managing their time, and they have good intentions about doing stuff, but then they don't do it. Well, if you have a good system of planning and managing your time, and the nice thing about a Franklin planner is you not only put in there what you want to do, but you have to check off whether you did it or put an X there when you didn't do it.
Yeah.
And I found that was very helpful. I remember I had to take a training because I was a supervisor working for the welfare department in Texas at the time. And I remember coming out of the class thinking, that's a bunch of crap. I was not very impressed by it after having spent a day listening to them talk about it. But I got a free planner out of it. So I thought, I might as well just try it and see how it goes. And I found that just the fact that I was putting things on there that I needed to do, and then I was having to check it off or put an X that said that I didn't do it, or an arrow that said I was moving it down the road, kept me focused on what I needed to do. And it was also a way of holding yourself accountable for things. And it helped me a lot with my job, but it also helped me a lot with my spiritual life, because what I would do is on my task list for every day, because I use the classic Franklin Covey paper planner, even though you can get a digital forms of it,
Mm-hmm.
but I like the paper. But at the top of every day, I put on there that my morning prayers, and then I put that I'm usually, if unless I've got other stuff going on, I'll put on there that I'm going to go walking in the morning. And then I have other things that I want to do that day. Like I have reading goals that I try to keep up with, and then other goals like things that I need to do every week for um, liturgical text preparation, working on the calendar, doing the bulletin for our parish, those kinds of things. So I plug those things in ahead of time. But I just found that having those things on there helped me stay focused on that, and I wasn't letting things fall through the cracks like I was before. And I was
Right.
being a lot bit more disciplined about my spiritual life as a result of that. So I think it's a really good tool. You know, if you live in a monastery, the monastery's life will keep you focused on your cycle of the day. So you'll have bells going off when it's time for a service during Lent. You know, they'll have a Samantran. They'll start pounding on that wood to wake everybody up at the right time to get them to go to church. And if all else fails, you'll get a knock on the door saying, "Hey, it's time to go to church." And so you have a cycle to your day that's there, and it's you don't need a planner if you're living like that, because the monastery's life is providing you with your the outline for your day. But for those of us that are living in the world, we need to provide ourselves with that kind of structure. And if you just let the day unfold as it will, what's going to happen is that people are going to be pulling you this way and pulling you that way because they have priorities that they would like you to take care of, but you have your priorities that you need to take care of too. And so you have to balance out, is their priority something that's really my priority? And
Mm-hmm.
and how big of a priority is it, and how do I fit it all in? And so not just the planner itself, but also the trainings that they provide, I find I found them to be very helpful in terms of how to think about filtering those things through. Um, I mean, I could keep going on about that. I mean, one thing there was a part of the training they were talking about the quadrants of priorities or something like that. But one quadrant, basically, on one side they had urgent, and then not urgent, and then another part of the thing, it was um, um, necessary or unnecessary. But
Right.
so something could be urgent but not necessary. So in other words, you might have somebody saying, "Hey, I need you to come over to my house and watch this game show." You know, well, that's urgent, but it's not important. uh, and but you know, if your granddaughter is saying, "Hey, Grandpa, I need you to fix this for me," it might not be in the grand scheme of things all that important. But on the other hand, if you love your granddaughter, you might up it into the higher priority category just because you don't want to disappoint her. So you have to think about, how am I weighing these things, and what really is the more important thing for me to do, and try to take care of what's urgent and important is the thing that you want to try to spend as much of your time on as possible. But also things that are not necessarily urgent but still important, you don't want to blow those things off either. And you certainly don't want to be spending your time on things that are neither urgent nor important. Those are the things that you want to try to be avoiding as much as possible, although all of us have to unwind. And so there's a little bit of time we're going to be spending doing that too. But it's important in a certain sense.
Right. Okay. So when you're putting together your day, and let's say a person lives like 3 hours away from a church. So the closest Orthodox church to them is 3 hours away. Well, I have a friend that's in this exact scenario. He lives in Australia, and he's not extremely active in the church. You know, I believe it was you I had heard talk about the big red book that has all the services.
Yeah, the Nasser 5 pounder, as it's affectionately known. It's one book that has a little bit of everything, and with that one book, you could do something for Sundays and feasts throughout the year. It wouldn't necessarily be everything that would be dotting all your I's and crossing your T's, but you would have at least something that you could do the service with.
And I actually, after I heard you talk about it, I went out and bought it, and I got it in, and I looked through it, and I got with one of the Cradle Orthodox that I go to church with, and we spent an afternoon going through it, and he was kind of explaining to me how it operates, because, and they call it the Big Red Book. That's why that popped in my head. But that's what they used to do the
Right.
liturgical services out of years ago when he was growing up. So he really had a good understanding of the book. So I was able to utilize that resource and speak to him. But it's a good idea to have, I think personally, to have a hard copy of these things, because you never know when something's going to happen. If you're on vacation with your family and you don't have access to internet for whatever reason, or you don't have access to a church, you could have this book with you, and it's something that y'all could do, a reading that night. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. So I went out and bought one, and have spent time reading through it. And I don't understand the tones personally. I go to an Antiochian church, and I think the tones are a little different than Russian with in the Antiochian church, but I don't understand the tones. And a lot of times I find myself a little frustrated because I don't understand the tones. So I'm like reading through it, and I'm like, I know that's not the way it's supposed to sound. And so I'll even try to do like a plain chant at times, just to kind of get in the rhythm of
That
worship.
would be better than just reading it in a normal voice. But the Antiochians typically do Byzantine chant, although that wasn't always the case. A lot of Antiochian parishes did Russian chant, but sometime, maybe it was in the 90s, they started pushing people in parishes to learn Byzantine chant, which is fine. It's just Byzantine chant's a lot harder to learn. You know,
I've
I
noticed
only know some things in Byzantine chant because to do it properly, there's a system to it, and I never learned it.
one of the things I've noticed going to different uh, churches and visiting is some of the choirs sound more American than others. There's
Right.
kind of an American style. I don't know if this is a new technology that's just starting to pop up, but or maybe not technology, maybe innovation would be the best way of saying it. That's beginning to pop up. But I mean, is is there is there is there a downfall to the kind of like bringing in our own type of cultural influences into the services?
I think there certainly could be. I know that Clark Carlton's a friend of mine. I've known him for a very long time, and the first time I had a face-to-face conversation with him, he was talking about this whole idea that he has about we should have American tones. We should. There's no reason why we should use Russian tones or Byzantine tones. We should come up with our own tones. Well, I think that sounds good in theory, but when the Orthodox faith was brought to the Russians, you didn't have a committee of Russians that said, you know what, we need to dump these Byzantine tones and come up with our own Russian tones. What happened was is they learned Byzantine chant, and then it evolved over time, and now you have the Russian musical tradition.
Hmm.
But when you're talking about, there are some parts of the service where you're not singing it according to a tone. It's a composition of some sort. And so there are American composers that do try to come up with music that, it's not outside the bounds of the Orthodox tradition, but instead of trying to make the English words fit Russian compositions, they try to come up with new compositions that actually make use of the flow of the words in English. And so it sounds different, than when you're trying to squeeze words into a composition that wasn't really designed for English.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some Russian melodies for things that I think are beautiful, but I don't even know how you would do it in English. Like there's a part of Matins where we sing what's called the Evogatari, or Blessed art thou, Lord, teach me thy statutes. But I remember hearing a version of that in Slavonic, which I always thought was very beautiful, but it would not work in English.
Mm.
And the refrain of that in Slavonic was something like Благословен си Господи, научи меня и проптанием твоим, something like that. But just the way the wording is in English, you couldn't do it like that, but it
Right.
flows so well with the Slavonic that it's really cool. So I think that is good that we've got composers like Kurt Sanders that are trying to do that, to make use of the flow of the English words, so that we have music that works better. But in terms of like a tonal system, I think it would be a disaster for us to come up with an American tonal system that we were just trying to pull out of thin air. It's better to allow something like that sort of develop over time. And like in Japan, they learn Russian singing, but if you hear Japanese singing today, it doesn't sound the same. As you can tell that it's a relative, but it doesn't sound the same because they've made it work with their Japanese text.
Mm.
And I think the same thing will happen with English over time, as it will gradually evolve into its own thing. In Russian chant, uh, the older form of it is closer to Byzantine chant. It's called Znameny chant, but it's still different. But if someone was interested in learning Znameny chant, the Old Rite Parish in Erie, Pennsylvania, actually has YouTube videos where they teach people how to read Znameny notation and how to do Znameny chant. But there's probably videos that teach you how to do Byzantine chant to the proper way. It's just, like I said, it's a lot more difficult, in my opinion, than learning the Russian tones. The Russian tones that we use today, typically in the Russian church, are what are known as Kievan chant. So it comes from the Kiev caves, Lavra, and it is a little bit more Western in its style. And I'm not sure exactly how it evolved out of Znameny chant. I just know that it works, and it works with English, and it sounds good.
I mean, if it works, it works.
Right.
So, when it comes to the services, like obviously there are, when you're going through the liturgical books and you're reading them, there are parts that are reserved for priests. So your layman wouldn't be reading that, right? Like if you go through the Akathist, an Akathist will have sections for the priests, and then it'll have sections for the choir. And so, like, if you're doing like an Akathist at home, would you just altogether skip over the parts that the priests do, or do you like read them silently? How would you approach that?
Well, then a Catholic, you could do everything yourself. It's just that when you do that as part of a service with a priest, there are things that the priest do. But an akathist is actually a genre that Russians really love. There's actually only one akathist that's an ancient akathist, and it's the only one that's actually appointed to be done in church in the services, and that's the akathist to the Mother of God. And then there's the akathist to the Savior, which is pretty old, and I think Greeks do use it, but Greeks don't have anything like the number of akathists that Russians have, because Russians love them. And one of the nice things about an akathist is typically once you learn how to sing an akathist, most akathists are written with the same pattern. So that means that you could sing the same pattern for most way you sing the akathist to the Mother of God, and that way, without a whole lot of knowledge, you could do these things. So this actually is something you're talking about. Let's say we got a guy who's just learning about Orthodoxy, and he's 3 hours away from church, and he doesn't know how to sing the tones yet or anything like that. So he hasn't learned how to put services together. What I would recommend somebody like that do would be to probably on a Saturday night do small comp line, which is a lot less complicated and doesn't need to be sung, and then sing the akathist at the part where the kathas would be inserted. And what you could do is there's two books of akathas that Jordan Bill publishes, and there's also a lot of akathas that are online. But for a typical Sunday, for example, you could just sing the akathas to the resurrection, and do that as part of small comp line. But there's also akathas that relate sort of like to the themes of Holy Weeks. There's an akathas to the Passion of Christ. There's an akathas to the cross, which you could do on Holy Friday. There's an akathas for communion, which is actually something that could be done on Holy Thursday. There's an akathas to the tomb and resurrection, which you could do on Holy Saturday. And like I said, there's the akathas to the resurrection that you could do on Pascha. And but there's also akathas for various important saints, and not all those are in those two books. You can get them from some other sources. So, for example, let's say it's St. John. Let's to St. John. So, if you didn't know how to sing your way through a vigil, but you wanted to celebrate his feast day, because not super hard, and even if you didn't know how to sing it, you could at least read it. But particularly along with the variable parts, and you know how to plug them in, you would not have a hard time learning how to do Typica. And Typica basically has everything that is in the liturgy without the sacraments. So you've got the scripture readings, the Tropari, the Cantacia, the Proclaiming of the Alleluia verses, all that stuff, the Beatitude verses, but you don't have the sacraments, obviously, because you can't do that without the priest.
Right. And another book that I heard Father Turbo talk about that I went out and bought immediately, and I'm glad I did, because apparently it's very hard to find. And I didn't realize that until I started looking for it for my parents, because my dad was he was just accepted into the church. He was just baptized earlier this year at up there near you, actually, up in Magnolia. There's a small Greek mission up there that they're attending, called Saint Cyril of Jerusalem.
Oh, that's OCA. Yeah, I was familiar with that. When you said Greek, I was thinking there must be a mission that I'm not familiar with, but that's OCA.
Oh yes, sir. It's
Yeah,
OCA. It's they're Greek, but they're not Goarch. They're OCA.
right,
Yes.
right. Yeah,
Yeah, and so he's been going there, and he really enjoys it. And Father Benedict is pretty cool. You know,
yeah.
I got
Good
to meet
priest.
him. I
Yeah,
went for his baptism. Yeah, he was
yeah.
really cool. They have a piece of the cross there that he insisted I held, and I felt I felt terrible. I was like, I'm gonna break this. Like, take it back. But Father Turbo had talked about the prologue by Saint Nikolai. I'm looking at one of the volumes right now.
Yeah.
So in the prologue, I find it very helpful, especially in the mornings, because it goes pretty quick. You have readings of some saints, and then you have a homily. But there's also usually a song involved, and it's dedicated to one of the saints. Is there a particular way to sing these uh these hymns to the saints?
Not the ones that are in the prologue that I know of. Now, there, Saint Nikolai wrote that in Serbian, and he was a famous poet. And a number of his poems have actually been put to music, but I don't think they were put to music by him. They were put to music by other people. But there's some very impressive pieces of poetry, and so there may be a way to do it. I don't think that I don't know what it is, if there is a particular way to do it. I mean, you certainly could sing it to like the Stykian melody or something like that if you wanted to, but it
Mhm.
doesn't give you a tone. As at least not that I recall. It's been a while since I've looked at the prologue. I used to read it to my kids. I usually did it in the evening with the kids, so we'd pray, and then I'd read them the prologue. We'd read the Bible, and
Hmm.
I'd have them read the Bible to me. That's one thing I recommend to parents: is when your kids are old enough to start reading, have them read the Bible to you, and that way you can correct their pronunciation of words. You can talk about what the text means. You can explain words to them that they don't know, and then I would usually try to read them something. Um, like when they were really little, I started reading them like the tales of King Arthur and the old English translation or text that you can still find. I think that the author's Pile, if I'm remembering correctly. And I did that on purpose because it gave me another opportunity to teach them older forms of English as I would tell them a story, and they enjoyed it. And then I got into the tales of Robin Hood and that kind of stuff. And later on, I would read them things like Oliver Twist. But So that was an evening ritual for me. But if it works for somebody to read it in the morning, there's no that either. And so, because we should be reading this, praying in the morning, praying in the evening, and when you do your reading is just really a question of what works best for you.
Mm. Yeah. I I find that it helps me start my day off on the right foot, and it's just, it puts me in the right mode because I I find if I get off track during the day, then getting back on track once I'm off work and home is very difficult for me.
Well, now that I'm retired from the state of Texas, if I don't have services in the morning, I do read the Bible in the morning after I get done. I pray first, I go walking, and then I read the Bible. But I read other things in the evening. But if I still had kids that I was raising, I would probably do the Bible reading in the evening with them, just because it's a little easier to get everybody, uh, on the same page in the evening than it is in the morning. I get up pretty
Mhm.
early usually.
Yeah, I do too. I try to get up early enough where I have time to say my prayers and do a
Right.
little reading and drink a lot of coffee before I have to go deal with people.
Right. Yeah.
So, um, when okay, so we were you were talking about small comp line on Saturday. How is that compared to like matins?
Well, small comp is a distinct service. So if you're doing the full cycle of services in a day and it's not a great feast, the day begins with Vespers and then there's small comp line. So in Greek, the words that we translate as small comp line is literally after dinner. So in a monastery, you would have Vespers and then you would eat in the
Mm,
evening. And then you would do small comp line. Now, in a lot of monasteries, they actually will do Vespers and small comp line together. So actually, they'll do ninth hour Vespers and small comp line. But in Jordanville, they would do small comp line, after dinner.
mm,
And then in the wee hours of the morning, there's the midnight office, and then early in the morning, uh, there's the matins, and then after matins, you've got the first, third, 6th hour, and then you've got the divine liturgy.
mhm,
So those are that's the cycle of a normal day in a monastery. So matins is the distinct service. It's just that matins is one of the more complicated services. So if I was giving somebody advice on what to do and they didn't know anything, I might not even start them off with small comp line. There's the rule of Saint Pachomius is the most ancient prayer rule that we have, and it consists of what are called the Trisagion prayers, or the opening prayers, the 50th Psalm, the Creed, and then saying the Jesus prayer 100 times, and then the dismissal prayers. So you've got "It is truly meet," etc., with the dismissal laid at, set up as a layman would do it. What I hand copies of this to people a lot in confession, but also when someone's a new catechumen, I'll give them a copy of this, because what I explained to them is you can think of the rule of St. Pachomius like it's a sandwich. And there's the top slice of the sandwich, which is everything prior to getting to the Jesus prayer. And then there's the bottom slice of the sandwich, which is the dismissal prayers. But just like you could put peanut butter jelly in a sandwich, or you could put ham in the sandwich, or you could put whatever else you want in a sandwich, you can change out what goes into the middle. Well, if somebody was just learning the services, I would probably start them off with saying, just do the rule of St. Pachomius, but instead of doing the Jesus prayer, put an akathist in there for Saturday night. And then Sunday morning, do the third, the sixth hour, and then do Typica. And I would walk them through Typica, but even more simple than that, the most simple reader services that you can do are what you find in your prayer book: morning prayers and evening prayers. Everything's laid out exactly as you're supposed to do it. You don't really have to sing any of it. So that's a good place to start too.
And when we were talking earlier about like not reading in your regular voice, the actual like plain chant. When these people are getting started in their prayer rule,
right,
would it be beneficial to them to learn how to plain chant?
It would. Now, Antiochians, for some reason, when someone reads the epistle in an Antiochian parish, I often hear them read it in a normal voice, and that's really not traditional. Although if your priest tells you to do that, you need to do what your priest tells you to do. But just for example, I've got my epistle book here. So just taking a reading at random here, if you're just reading this in a normal voice, the way I hear it a lot of times in Antiochian verses, it would be, "Brethren, watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, be strong, let all things be done with charity." Well, the problem with that is people are trying to emote the reading. They're trying to emphasize the right words, and they're putting in an interpretation on the reading, and I find it very distracting. Now, that's probably because I'm just not used to it, and maybe if that was what I was used to, it wouldn't bother me at all. So I'm with that caveat. But the way you plain chant a reading would be like this: "Brethren, watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, be strong, let all things be done with charity. I beseech you, brethren, ye know that the house of Stephanus, that it is the first fruits of Achaia." Well, you just keep doing that, but of course, in church especially, when you get to the end of a reading, you do want to make a little bit of a difference in your voice so that the priest knows you're done. So when you get to the end, you'd say, "My love be with you all in Christ Jesus, amen." So you do this rising and then falling so that the priest knows, okay, he's done, because otherwise, if you pause, the priest might think you got more to do. Or if you didn't do the ending like that, you might pause because you're turning a page, and then the priest thinks you're done with the reading and then it moves on or something like that. So that way of communicating between the reader and the priest is very important. But I also think that when you're doing your morning and your evening prayers in a plain chant like that, it's just more prayerful. And it does take you trying to emote or interpret the reading out of the equation. You're just reading it, and you let the words do the moving with people rather than your reading ability and interpretations move people.
Right. Yeah. No. And whenever I was first brought into the church, they had asked me to read the Psalms during Orthros, and I found myself like that, emoting, where I felt what was like pulling to me, like where I was getting a message or whatever. And there's one of the ladies that goes to the church. She's a reader, but she used to be a nun in San Francisco at a Catholic monastery. And I noticed that when she was doing Psalm 50, she was doing that plain chant, and there's something, it's like there's something more to it than you get when somebody's reading it and emoting.
Yeah,
You're get, I don't know, by listening to her, I get more out of it by just like letting myself like kind of get absorbed in that rhythm. There's kind of a rhythm to plain
right.
chant, and there's something very beautiful about it. But it took me a minute to kind of, I say a minute, and I mean that in like the Texas slang way. It took me a while to
Right.
really kind of like get my mind flipped to that. But now I'm used to it, I appreciate it much more than when I hear somebody read.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's more prayerful. It's certainly less distracting, at least to me. And what I would suggest to people is if if the parish that's 3 hours away from you does live streaming of their services, it would be a good idea for you to watch those, just because you'll learn how they do the services. You can get a feel for the reading rhythm that's done, because it's really just no one ever sat down with me and said, here's how you plain chant a reading.
Mm-hmm.
I just learned it because I heard people doing it, and then when it was my turn to read, started doing the same thing they were doing. It's just a matter of exposing yourself to it and getting used to it. So that's what I would recommend. That's one advantage we have nowadays that we used to not have. But you can just, there are hours and hours of services that are being posted on YouTube from parishes all over the country. So if you just pick a parish that uses the same translations that you're trying to use and sings the same way that you're trying to learn how to sing, that will, and presumably a parish that does it pretty well, that will help you.
Now, there's a when you're when you're when you're diving into this and you're first discovering orthodoxy, a big question that a lot of people have is, which Orthodox church do I go to? Do I go to a Greek Orthodox church? Do I go to a OCA? Do I go to Antiochian? Like, which church do I go to? Obviously, you're part of the ROCOR uh, churches. How do people determine that? Like with me, it was pretty easy for me because there's one church close to me. It's like I live in a small town.
Right.
There's one church. It's been here since what, 18, we just celebrated 125 years.
Right.
So
It
this
was
church,
consecrated by Saint Raphael Halloweeny.
yes,
Yeah.
sir. And and it's kind of like it has several satellites. I mean, several that you know of, St.
Right.
George there in Houston, St.
Right.
Joseph, St. Anthony's. Now St. Joseph's got a second location out in Rosenberg, I think it is.
I believe so. Yeah.
And then we have a small parish in Lake Charles, the that Father Michael goes to, I think, one Saturday a month and does a liturgy on Saturday there, and then he'll do the liturgy here in Beaumont on Sunday. And they just got, which is just an interesting tidbit. Somebody I think it was last year, it was either last year or the year before, somebody donated 6 acres to St. John's in Lake Charles. So there will be a church being built in Lake
Wow, that's good
Charles.
to know.
Yeah, it's wild. And then I believe Archangel Gabriel in Lafayette is also a satellite of St. Michael's. So I mean, but so
That's
there
impressive. I
are,
didn't realize that they had had a role in founding all those parishes, but it makes sense because I know that they were the first Antiochian parish anywhere near any of those cities. So it makes sense
right.
that they would have had a hand in it.
Yeah, it's
Um,
wild.
yeah, although when Saint Raphael was consecrated, it was actually still part of the Russian Church, but it was their mission that they had, and that became the Antiochian Archdiocese. But um, when it comes to these kinds of things, just in terms of my own jurisdictional affiliation, a lot of people that wind up in ROCOR start off in other jurisdictions and they say, I don't like those other jurisdictions, and they come into ROCOR. And sometimes they've got a bit of chip on their shoulder about those other jurisdictions as a result of it. That wasn't what happened with me. The first priest that I mentioned a meeting was a ROCOR priest. So I've never not been in row corps since I became Orthodox or even became interested in Orthodoxy. So if a lot does depend on your circumstances, and the minimum issue, of course, is are they legitimately Orthodox? Are they canonical Orthodox
Right.
parishes? Because there certainly are some bogus ones out there. But the next question, though, is going to be, is this a parish that actually is going to work? Because unfortunately, there are some row corps parishes that someone who's an English speaker might go to, and it would probably be very difficult for them to attend just because the services are mostly in Slavonic and they're not, linguistically inclined, and it's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
When I was at St. Vladimir in Houston, another reason why I really wanted to get an English language parish started was I would see people who would come and visit who were interested in Orthodoxy, but they wouldn't keep coming because of the language barrier. And also, when I would go around Houston, I would often meet people in Antiochian parishes who, when I would get talking to them, I'd find out, well, they actually, when they were kids, were going to the St. Vladimir. But at some point in their life, they wound up in those Antiochian parishes. Well, the thing is, I'm just glad that they were at least still Orthodox. But why were they going to these Antiochian parishes? Maybe it was because it was closer, but I think in a lot of cases it was because they could understand the services. So you have to find a parish that you can actually handle for, in terms of the language. There could also be other issues, like some parishes are not particularly healthy for one reason or another. And so you might go there, but, people are not friendly, and, those kinds of things. So if you have a better option, uh, you might drive a little bit further, to go to a parish where the people are friendlier and more welcoming. But it really is going to be a question that's going to be conditioned on where are you and what are your options. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I normally do if I'm talking to somebody and they're saying, "Hey, I live out here in Timbuktu, where do I go?" is I'll get out. I'll look on some parish locators. Like there's Orthodoxy in America is a website that's pretty good parish locator, and there's also the Assembly of Bishops has a parish locator, and those are probably the two best parish locators if you're trying to find all the jurisdictional options that you have in an area. Now, every jurisdiction has their own parish locator too. And so if you were looking for a row corps parish, you could go to the row corps parish locator and find that. But you might not find one that's very close. So I would recommend looking at what your other options are, because if I'm talking to a layman and the nearest row corps parish is 5 hours away and they've got an OCA parish that's 5 minutes away, I'm not going to tell them to drive 5 hours to go to the row corps parish, unless that OCA parish has got some very serious problems. It would have to be a
Right.
really bad setting for me to tell someone to drive past that and go somewhere else. So, whatever your options are, you want to look at those and see, does this look like it's going to work? And it doesn't hurt to be talking to someone who you trust, who can maybe give you a little bit of guidance, and then go from there.
You have time for two more questions?
Sure.
Okay. Um, what is the importance when somebody's going out into this kind of venture into Orthodoxy, especially somebody that doesn't have a church close to them, that may be doing some of the readings at home, um, possibly trying to keep up with the small comp line on Saturday nights? What's the importance of having, like, whether it's a wife or a husband or just a good friend that's also interested in having that partnership in getting involved in Orthodoxy?
Are you talking about like trying to do services with other people when
Well,
you're isolated?
trying to do services with other people, but also, okay, so one of the things that I heard a priest talk about a while back, and I can't remember who it was, so forgive me, was that men are typically attracted to the intellectual kind of stimulation of orthodoxy, and they get real fired up real early on. And women are more attracted to the hospitality, more attracted to the communal side of orthodoxy. And it takes them a little bit longer to build those relationships. But by the time that a woman has started to build that community and build those friendships and that are really tight bonding type of relationships, that man's kind of burn out and the woman starts kind of pulling whereas at first the man was pulling the woman along, now the woman's kind of pulling the man along, and then everything kind of balances out, and they both are working equal but separate roles in the
Right.
conversion of the family. And my wife is atheist. She does not go to church with me. And so I have found that there are times where I'm like, okay, I got to do this and I got to like force myself to do it because I don't have that other side of me kind of pulling me into that communal side.
Right.
So, how important is it to bring somebody along with you on the journey? And just whether it's to do the reader services on your own or to be attentive in going to church and being part of the church and really experiencing that Orthodox life?
Well, I think it's very important not to do this as a lone ranger because you can't receive sacraments that way, of course. And you do need to have communal connections, even if they're remote. And certainly, if you're married, you should want your spouse to be making this journey with you. Now, it often is the case that one spouse gets interested in Orthodoxy and the other one is not there, at least at first. Usually it's the man in that driver's seat, but I've seen increasingly situations where it's the woman who's gotten interested in Orthodoxy and the man's a little bit more reluctant, but he maybe gets interested. Uh, but uh, but you if it's all possible, want to have your home united. And what you said about the difference between men and women and how they connect to the church is certainly true. Women do tend to be more relational in terms of how they approach it. And so one thing is that if I'm talking to a guy who has a wife who's not as interested in Orthodoxy, what I try to encourage them to do is to get them to bring her to church, particularly on occasions where it's going to be more fellowship and it's less threatening. So the Agape Vespers is a good example of this, just because it's a relatively short service followed by a big picnic. And so if you brought somebody to that, even if it wasn't your spouse, just somebody you were trying to get interested in Orthodoxy, they'd have lots of times to meet people.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly for women, once they start making relationships in a parish, it's a lot easier for them to imagine actually joining it. And so you're not normally going to talk the average woman into Orthodoxy by making the theological arguments. It's usually going to be, I mean, not to say that that's not going to be an issue at all, but it's going to be more an issue of them actually starting to make a connection with people in the parish, and then they can start to imagine doing the move because it's not just an abstract thing anymore. So
One of
I
the
think all that's important.
one of the stories I heard, and just I guess this is just kind of so people don't get frustrated, was there was a man who joined the Orthodox Church and his wife was hesitant to it, beyond hesitant. She was just totally against it. She's like, I'm not doing this. I'm not getting involved in this. And 25 years later, she ended up joining the church too. So, it doesn't always happen
Yeah.
overnight. So
You certainly have cases like that where a spouse does eventually come along many years later like that, but it often can be a lot shorter. But it does require patience, and you can't beat the other person over the head on the issue and force them. With my wife, I studied Orthodoxy for about a year before I even talked to her about it because I wanted to make sure that that's what I wanted to do before I started talking to her about it, because I didn't want to confuse her.
mhm.
In other words, if I came to the conclusion at the end of my studies, I don't think Orthodoxy was right, I didn't want to spend a year giving her all this stuff and making her think that maybe it was right, and then have to undo all the damage that I had done. So I just kept it to myself until I was convinced. And then I told her about it. Well, the thing is, I was a lot further down the road, obviously, than she was at that point. But and I tried, to convince her with the intellectual arguments, but I found that wasn't working so well. But she was coming to church with me, so that certainly helped. Also, my mother moved in with us, and I think my mother helped talk my wife into Orthodoxy more than I did, because my mother was constantly making snide comments about Orthodoxy. And I think my wife's instinctive loyalty caused her to want to defend what I was doing. But for my wife, I think it was building the relationships, but also being in the services. And for her, uh, it was I'd pretty much given up on her converting, actually, because I didn't think she didn't seem like she was going to do it. And that's why I actually enlisted in the Marine Corps right before the first Gulf War, because I figured, well, if I can't be a clergyman, I'm gonna have to do something else with my life, and there's this war coming down the pike. So I enlisted in the Marine Corps. But it was on Holy it, it was a Holy Thursday evening, so it's the matins of Holy Friday, which are known as the 12 Passion Gospels also. That service was what did it for her. And after the service, she said, what do I need to do to become Orthodox? And that came as a pleasant surprise, because I wasn't expecting it.
All right. And okay, so what people might fall into this trap when they first start going down the road of Orthodoxy, especially if they're doing like the akathist and these things on their own, that they may want to try to find shortcuts. They may want to innovate to make things easier on them because they don't quite understand what's going on. Can you just give some warnings for people to heed about why they should not be trying to innovate, why there's, even if they don't understand it, why they are doing what they're doing, that they should just stick with it?
Well, I think that if you need to make modifications to what you're doing, you should talk to the priest of the parish that you're um, trying to join, if you're not already Orthodox, and then let that priest give you guidance, because it might not be practical for whatever reason. Certainly, I learned how to do a vigil before I was in a situation where I had to do reader service vigils. So
Right.
so we were doing vigils right off the bat because I already knew how to do it. And there's something about doing reader services that I found very intimate and beautiful. I enjoyed it, although I longed for being able to do the full services and have the mysteries on a regular basis.
Right.
But reader services can be done very beautifully. But if you weren't there, and I would say most people are not going to be at the point where, okay, I'm interested in Orthodoxy, now let me do a 2.5 hour vigil on Saturday night. So you want to get some advice on, okay, what should I do? And if you're having problems, say, here is the problem I'm having, and then let the priest give you some guidance on what adjustments you might make, because there's usually going to be ways that you could adjust it. You shouldn't just make stuff up, and you also you shouldn't be your own spiritual guide, and just decide to do things on your own without getting some guidance, because you're obviously not in a good position to be your own guide.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't need any more popes.
Right.
So,
Right.
all right. How's the building coming along?
Well, we are going to be meeting with the architect, not this week, but basically about a week and a half from now, to start finalizing some of the details about the church. We've already got the permit request in for the parking lot and stuff. And so I'm hoping we can actually get some stuff starting to move in the not too distant future, because we really want to ideally be in our new church by our feast day next year, because that's the 100th anniversary of the repose of St. Jonah. So
Oh,
that's what
wow.
we're shooting for.
Wow. Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised a couple of weeks ago. It was Father's Day weekend, and I it was right after the PLC, and I met Metropolitan Saba was down, and so I had an opportunity to meet him, and we took a picture with him. So I texted Buck the picture with him, and he was like, "Oh yeah, well I was doing this today," and he texted me a picture of you and him together. So I was like, "Oh okay." So
Yeah, his father lives in the area, as I recall, so he was there he was at our parish for Father's Day.
yeah, I think he lives in Spring, right,
Yeah,
right, like 10 minutes away. I think he said it's right there
yeah,
in the general area.
yeah.
So all right, well, you have anything you want to plug?
Well, I mean, the parish website, Saint spelled out Jonah.org. My blog is father spelled out john.blogspot.com. And my sermons are posted on our website as well as on Ancient Faith Radio.
And the
And we have
St.
a
Jonah
YouTube channel.
YouTube channel,
Right,
where you're releasing those videos. So
right, right.
yeah, yeah, I got a
And,
few
and
notes taken down here.
in the St. Jonah YouTube channel, we do live stream our Sunday morning liturgies and a few other services occasionally. But we also have been posting the uh, videos from Bible studies that we've been doing. We're taking a break for summer, but I intend to keep doing that too. So that's another reason why you might be interested in checking that channel out.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go subscribe right now. So I appreciate you coming back on, Father. It's always a
Well, you're
pleasure to
welcome.
speak to you.
Thank you.
I'm promise I'm gonna make it to Houston one of these Sundays. I drive truck for a living. You know how hard it is to get me to leave the house.
Well, it'd be
All
nice to
right.
have you up and visit for a visit sometime.
I will definitely do it. It won't
Okay.
be long. All
Okay.
right. I'm going to stop the recording.